Welcome, Adam's Child, to this week's sermon, where we investigate the fate of the U.S. federal and state governments to understand what happened and why to the pre-war world's most powerful nation after being broken by the almighty atom. Let's crank up the rads and get into it. Fallout's world is a facsimile of our own, simultaneously familiar and foreign, and this is soundly exemplified by the in-game United States government. From the highest office in the country, down to the governors and even city mayors, what actually happened to those that called the shots and steered the country into its own fiery destruction? Who perished? Who survived? What was destroyed? And most importantly, did the United States government actually make it through the worst attack the country has ever experienced? The federal government, the bigwigs, the ones we usually first think of when the word government is said, often offices like the president, the vice president, Congress, and the host of advisors, secretaries, and others had a number of interesting, tragic, and unpredictable fates when the world decided to push the big red reset button. The most powerful elements of both the federal government and the military had a leg up on nearly everyone else because, unsurprisingly, they had an early warning that the world was about to end. With all the resources, the satellites, spies, and throngs of intelligence agents that they had at their fingertips, as the savage Sino-American War grew ever more desperate, while American forces pressed the attack on China's mainland, the government had some precious moments of warning, the kind of warning that, if everyone had it, many more people would have survived. The evidence of this system is most plainly laid out in pre-war West Virginia. An anti-automation, staunchly pro-worker senator known as Sam Blackwell noticed so-called time discrepancies between the military and civilian nuclear warning systems. He was warned by someone within the Department of Defense to cease investigating this matter any further and not to make this information public unless he wanted to spend the rest of his life in jail. This early warning system that benefited the military and government was confirmed to exist and work when an Army colonel broke protocol by informing a civilian friend, "Bombers incoming. Get to shelter. See you on the other side." Why the secrecy, though? Surely if more people were to survive, that would be a better outcome. Well, the government chose to keep this fact hidden so that they would have a better chance at surviving Armageddon if they could retreat to bunkers without the chaos and mass panic that a nuclear warning would induce in the general populace. A small portion of an early warning system log gives us an idea of which government officials were on the warning list. The log shows that the president, vice president, speaker of the House, and some of the presidential cabinet were all on the list, but not all of them got the early warning message. The President of the United States received the message and began to travel to an area unique from everyone else on this list, codenamed PR-002. 3 cabinet secretaries successfully received the message and immediately set en route to the same place, CB-002. Interestingly, 4 of the individuals in the logs were removed from the list and therefore did not receive this early warning. And, most curious of all, the vice president himself had a message sent, but there was no confirmation received, and therefore we have no idea where they ended up. And let's remember this detail. The vast halls of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. has turned into a battlefield between super mutants and mercenaries 200 years after the Great War. But examining the centuries-old debris for clues about the Day of Days, we barely see a single skeleton. Even though the ruins of D.C. are littered with the skeletal remains of countless victims even 200 years after the bombs fell, the sprawling complex of the Capitol building has only 3 skeletons. Seriously, the only 3 are in the lower level of the Capitol building complex. This giant building that had hundreds of congressional representatives, staff, and security only left 3 skeletons in the entire building. And it's not like someone did their community service and cleaned up all the skeletons. The Capitol building is a blood-soaked battlefield, and I don't know if you've looked around in Fallout 3, basically no one is cleaning up the old apocalyptic casualties and debris. they are perfectly fine sleeping next to garbage. So the federal government got advanced warning because of the military and intelligence apparatus that was constantly monitoring the volatile situation between the United States and China, but a warning is not all that useful without somewhere to go for shelter. No expense was spared when it came to constructing the most advanced, capable, and impenetrable command centers to ensure the continuity of government. Such locations include the real-world Raven Rock facility in southern Pennsylvania that is shown for the first time in Fallout 3, but even though this complex was purpose-built for a world-ending scenario, it actually went unused by anyone. The Cheyenne Mountain Complex, which was the base for the United States Space Command and NORAD that monitored for missile launches, aircraft intrusion, and even foreign spacecraft, was referenced in a GNN special broadcast that was released with the Fallout TV show as a, quote, mountain in Colorado that the president could take shelter in. But again, this was not actually used by the president. In the Fallout universe, it likely exists as a totally different facility, namely a very large Vault-Tec vault designated Vault Zero, as seen in Fallout Tactics. We must travel off the west coast of California to reach a secretive offshore oil rig that has been redesigned from the ground up to be a self-sustaining command center for the president and other worthy leaders. This Poseidon Energy oil rig was adapted to enable the president to continue leading the country in the face of nuclear annihilation and meant to be a complete secret. However, its existence had been uncovered by a journalist with high-up connections at a newspaper called the Boston Bugle, although the explosive article would actually never make it to print. Around April of 2077, half a year before the events of the Great War, the president and his cabinet quietly abandoned the White House and left it nearly empty, save for a skeleton maintenance crew. The president's absence had been noticed and caused no small amount of speculation as to where he and his cabinet were hiding out and why. According to high-up sources, they had apparently been spending all or nearly all of that time at the Poseidon oil rig, or should I call it by its secret official name, Control Station Enclave. For longtime fans of the series, the Enclave needs absolutely no introduction, but let's just say the Enclave is a huge part of the world of Fallout, and for good reason, since they purport to be the true continuation of the United States government in the post-war, and they very well may have a legitimate claim, or at least more legitimate than any other group. The President of the United States and at least most of his cabinet moved their base of governance from the White House to the Poseidon oil rig half a year before the bombs eventually fell, shortly after disbanding the White House press corps. The formation of this shadow government in the years leading up to the Great War was deliberate, calculated, and of utmost secrecy, since many leaders were convinced that the United States as we all know it would not survive an atomic exchange. Therefore, only those most dedicated to the country, only those willing to do whatever was required to destroy their ideological foe, the communists, and those that would let nothing stand in the way of a pure, reborn nation would even be considered as possible members. We can't be sure of the true extent of the Enclave web, but we know that high-ranking officials have been counted amongst the Enclave's ranks, including multiple presidents, joint chiefs of staff, department leaders, and senators, so this infiltration runs deep and wide. While the oil rig seems to have been intended for the president and those close to him, another secret bunker was constructed and intended for Congress not too far from Washington, D.C., in the state of West Virginia. Built as part of the White Spring Congressional Bunker Project, it was funded, built, and meticulously planned from the get to be an Enclave command and control center, self-sufficient and automated to allow seamless governance. It even had a complete presidential Oval Office that replaced the presidential seal with the star-encircled E, the symbol of the Enclave. It is not surprising then that once the early warning systems detected Chinese missiles and bombers, that those that counted themselves amongst the Enclave had a higher survival rate than anyone else in the nation's government. Several hours before the fateful morning of October 23rd, when Adam's holy flame would consume the United States, rumblings of an incoming attack began to reverberate off the halls of power, and at some point, an early warning system sent out the fateful messages we saw earlier. Launch detected, issuing cabinet warning. The president received the message and proceeded to PR-002, which many interpret to be the oil rig just off the California coast. PR could of course stand for a few things: Poseidon Rig, although it's kind of missing the oil part of the name, or even Presidential Retreat. But the 002 designation at the end makes it appear as though it was the second of two possible retreat options. The vice president had a message sent, but no confirmation was received for whatever reason, likely meaning that they did not have time to make it to a designated safe location. It is also worth considering that maybe they couldn't confirm receipt of the message because the vice president was already missing or dead. The Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of the Interior, and Secretary of Agriculture all had messages sent and were confirmed to be heading to CB-002, most likely standing for Congressional Bunker 2, which we know for a fact was the White Spring Bunker, the very one built under peculiar circumstances, having been planned and bankrolled by the Department of Agriculture of all places. The designation 002 again denotes that this was probably not the first potential retreat for government officials, and perhaps the strangely empty Raven Rock, having been built in the 1950s, 100 years before the events of the Great War, was the original safe house for the president and Congress, just as it is in our world. 4 known officials were originally meant to get an early warning, but had been removed from the list prior to the launching of missiles: the Speaker of the House, the Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, and the Secretary of Commerce. Although the total number of officials that were removed from the list is likely much higher, since this log that recorded the information truncated early. With the president secreted away to the oil rig and some of his cabinet successfully shuttled to the White Springs Bunker, there were a number of government officials who were not quite so fortunate, since they were not part of the Enclave, who had been preparing diligently for this day. There were 3 kinds of internal enemies to the Enclave and their plans: those that were not a part of the conspiracy and frankly had no idea of the Enclave and their plans, those that were not a part of the conspiracy but suspected or knew about it, and lastly, those that actively opposed it, and they were all dealt with in different ways. Senator Blackwell of Appalachia, who led the anti-automation crusade, had become a target by the Department of Defense and Enclave because of his inquiries into the Department of Agriculture, who were the ones bankrolling the White Spring Congressional Bunker. He was forced to abandon his position just before the Great War, though. He had received a threatening letter that insinuated harm would come to him and his daughter if he did not back down, and he took that threat very seriously. Blackwell and his daughter quietly disappeared, retreating to a personal bunker where they survived the initial events of the Great War, but not before he would do one last short interview. Risking his life, he publicly announced the existence of sinister forces within the government and agitated against them by advocating for a group of anti-government preppers known as the Free States. Although he would survive for a time with his daughter, after the war, he would eventually be tracked down by an Enclave hitman known as Jefferson Gray and killed in his private bunker because the surviving Enclave remnants in the area still thought that he was a threat. The most mysterious of the pre-war assassinations sanctioned by the Enclave is quite puzzling, but this is an absolutely necessary tangent. This particular event has generated quite a number of theories within the fanbase and occurred just down the road from the Rapidan camp, a casual presidential retreat built in Virginia in the early 1930s. It served initially as a place for presidents to just get away from the bustle of DC, but was expanded to include any federal official, senators, vice presidents, and even foreign dignitaries. We discover in-game that there was a motorcade with a black limousine and a few army vehicles that were making their way towards the camp when they came under fire from a sniper. Abandoned cars and skeletons in army uniforms can be seen lying about, along with what most people consider the target of this assassination. A skeleton lies propped up against the limousine with a black briefcase, and its skull is lying several feet away, seemingly a result of a very successful and very impressive headshot. The assassin had been lying in wait in a tower at the nearby Big Meadows gas well, providing a clear shot on all targets. Who this target is remains a mystery, as does who exactly was the one that ordered this assassination, since the only evidence we have to go off of is a paper labeled "Orders" found high up in the assassin's sniper nest, which reads, "By order of Bagman, target Zeus, target location Rapidan Complex. Long live the American way, God bless America." The message "God bless America" is certainly no stranger to American ears. However, in the Fallout universe, it is nearly universally used and associated with the Enclave. So someone codenamed Bagman ordered the assassination of an important official codenamed Zeus, so close to the events of the Great War that the bodily remains of the assassination lay exactly as they were when they were killed. There was no cleanup, no police investigation, and no widespread reporting of anyone important being killed. Nothing at the Rapidan camp indicates who the target may have been, although at this point I think there are two most likely explanations that fit the evidence. It's possible that the target could have been the vice president, since we know an early warning message was sent to him, but confirmation was never received. And if he was dead shortly before the events of the Great War, then this lack of message confirmation could absolutely make sense. If the vice president wasn't really, with the program, so to speak, that could have made him a target. Alternatively, other clues like the code name Zeus, the leader of the Greek gods on Mount Olympus, and similarities between this assassination and the real-world assassination of President John F. Kennedy could indicate that the target is the president himself. The assassin appears to have been killed, although it's not confirmed how or by whom, although it does appear to be self-inflicted since a lone skeleton is up in the sniper's nest with a 10mm pistol by his side. And the real or perhaps fake name of this assassin we know to be Harold Osborne, not too far off of the name of the real-world Kennedy assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. Additionally, Oswald sniped from an elevated position, striking the president in the head while he was in a car, and Oswald was killed before he could stand trial. All details which are remarkably similar to the assassination we observe in Fallout. It goes without saying, the loss of a president would be an incredibly destabilizing event and would seem to stand in contradiction to the fact that the president and his cabinet had been spending their time on the Poseidon oil rig for several months prior to the Great War. They were definitely in on the Enclave conspiracy. If, however, the assassination of the president cleared the way for someone else to become president, then it could make sense. That person could be the one who ordered the assassination, the mysterious Bagman. Although the evidence offers little as to his identity, by all appearances they seem associated with the Enclave due to the high-profile nature of this assassination, as well as the sign-off on the order note. Bagman is a name usually associated with money, particularly within organized crime, someone who runs and transports large sums of cash. Additionally, there is a more recent political bent to the name, which has been used to describe one who bribes political figures or otherwise deals with said bribes. Could this Bagman be a well-connected figure pulling strings behind the scenes through targeted bribes and payoffs? Tangentially, code names are used by the Secret Service to refer to the president and their family, as well as the vice president and other high-ranking officials, and Bagman could totally fit as a possible code name, although again this is usually only used by the Secret Service. Additionally, when considering who this Bagman could be and who would stand to benefit the most from getting the president out of the way, the vice president would make a lot of sense, and if they quickly assumed the position of the president, perhaps that is why the vice president never had the early warning message confirmed, because that office was now vacant. There is one other important component of this Bagman mystery, however, is that some nuclear launch logs from the other games indicate that missiles were authorized for launch in at least one, most likely two instances by this very same Bagman. Usually, only the President of the United States has the power to authorize the deployment of nuclear weapons, which makes the last pre-war President of the United States and established secret Enclave member a prime suspect. Alternatively, if the target was indeed the President, the objective could have been twofold: eliminate a president to put a more hardcore Enclave believer into the highest office, and/or to get a hold of the presidential emergency satchel, otherwise known as the nuclear football. Historically, the emergency satchel has been a briefcase carried by a military aide when the president is away from the White House, and this enables the president to authorize a nuclear strike remotely from anywhere. Since we see authorization codes from Bagman, the very one who ordered this hit, the nuclear football very well could have been the target. And the timing is all just very suspicious, since this whole operation occurred so close to the Great War that the remains lie precisely in the same spot as when they died. Did Bagman kill the president and replace him either with himself or someone else in the Enclave? Was the purpose more so to get access to the nuclear football in order to authorize launches, like we see recorded at Fort Constantine and the Hopeville missile base? Could this have been the start of the nuclear exchange? It is important to note that we know in Appalachia someone with the rank of general has the capability to authorize nuclear launches from the local missile silos if the automated DEFCON levels are high enough. So it seems that this Bagman may not necessarily have to be president. If a US military general had enough clout to authorize an assassination and the authority to launch nuclear missiles, we could quickly look at the known generals in the series to find a potential sinister match. Of the 13 known generals, 2 stand out as being the uncompromising type of person that would make the cut in the Enclave hierarchy. General C. Braxton worked with the Nuka-Cola Corporation to produce more potent weapons, and underhandedly gave Nuka-Cola's founder, Caleb Bradburton, life-extending technology that essentially made him a frozen, useless head that would sit alone for centuries. Braxton would also force companies to contribute to the war effort, threatening and extorting them like Dire Chemical until they begrudgingly agreed. General Constantine Chase is the general we know most about in the whole series, since he led the US forces in Alaska. Under his leadership, the United States retook Anchorage and the surrounding areas that the Chinese had conquered in their invasion, which kicked off the Sino-American War, and is therefore an American hero. However, Chase wasn't exactly a pillar of righteousness. He owned a research company that produced the chem Psycho that he then distributed to his troops, making them fearless, strong, and highly addicted. He personally supervised several projects, including the robot superweapon Liberty Prime, the virtual reality project that was meant to simulate the Battle of Anchorage, and he even gave proprietary virtual reality code to a leader within Vault-Tec to be used against the Dwellers as a type of failsafe. His extremely visceral anti-Chinese sentiments and over-the-top displays of machismo and patriotism reflect the Enclave aesthetic and ethos, and Chase has shown to be of dubious moral character. Therefore, he, out of all known generals, could top the list as a potential candidate for Bagman. Regardless if Zeus was the president, vice president, or someone else, or if Bagman was the president, a general, or an unknown official, it is clear that the Enclave had no problems with and actively pursued assassination of political allies to advance their goals. The brutal murders weren't just a pre-war method of preparing for a full takeover after the bombs dropped. They were an effective post-war method of consolidating power and removing any and all potential resistance for good, solidifying claims of total legitimacy and power. The White Springs congressional bunker that was meant to shelter much of the highest-ranking government officials would successfully admit dozens upon dozens of people, like department secretaries, congressmen, and support staff. But if the Enclave were to have ultimate control, they needed to purge all non-Enclave elements from those survivors that made it into the bunker. They did so immediately, separating the known Enclave members from the rest, thanking them for their service to the country, and mercilessly gunning them all down. Although some high-ranking officials got the warning calls and made it to the bunker, the Secretary of the Interior and Secretary of the Treasury, who, by the way, would both be near the top of the line of succession from the president, would die under mysterious circumstances. Acute radiation poisoning, according to the official reports. These very convenient deaths would make one Thomas Eckert, the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, the highest-ranking official. Eckert was an absolute war hawk. He had advocated within the government for a preemptive nuclear attack on China, something that surely would have ended in mutual destruction of both nations, and likely the world, but this would not have been a problem for him. Secretary Eckert and the Enclave as a whole had a plan, building secret bases and bunkers, and Eckert's ambitions would lead to the White Spring Bunker Complex conveniently having its hard lines to other important facilities, like Raven Rock and the Poseidon oil rig, completely severed and unable to communicate or coordinate. Isolated, angry, and with no internal opposition, Eckert would lead the Enclave in Appalachia to carry on their mission of continuing the nuclear war with China, as he claimed the highest office of the US government and the Enclave, the presidency. This subgroup of the Enclave with Eckert as president would not last more than 20 years after the war, as their attempts to gain access to the nuclear missiles would unleash a destructive force not even they could overcome. Government officials that did not make it to one of these places of safety because of their lack of affiliation with the Enclave, and who hadn't been purged before or after the Great War, are known to have met a variety of other fates. One powerful political family known as the Calverts, who had 3 senators, 7 House of Representatives, 2 governors, and even a presidential candidate at one point, were involved with something called the Great Game, which was a bizarre and often lethal rivalry between elites who would attempt to outwit, outmaneuver, and outsurvive each other. They went as far as preparing themselves to survive the Great War that they knew was coming so that they could continue their insane game, even if that meant turning oneself into a floating psychic head in a jar. And who knows what else this well-connected political family did to survive the Great War. One Joint Chief of Staff was incredibly lucky, as they were admitted into Vault 76 and therefore spared the death and destruction of nuclear annihilation and the potential fate of being purged by the Enclave. Another senator is confirmed to have been abducted by the Zayton aliens, who have taken a keen interest in Earth, with one single recording being the only known evidence of their unfortunate fate. One single senator was a victim of the Great War. Their body can be found in the underground presidential metro that connected the Capitol building, the White House, and Adams Air Force Base for efficient secret travel between the locations. While riding one of the trains on the Day of Days, one of the tunnels partially collapsed and crushed the Metro car, killing him and leaving him as the only known member of Congress to have been killed in Washington, D.C. on that day. Lastly, in Boston, we know of an elite social club called the Boylston Club, whose membership included current and former presidents, vice presidents, senators, and justices, along with their male heirs and anyone who could be both nominated by existing members and afford the $500,000 annual fee. A week after the Great War, in the throes of chaos, members of this club would meet for a final event, the Memoriam Gala, where they would raise their poison glasses to one final toast and forsake their destroyed world. There is no sure way to know who of the 14 skeletons are government officials, but given their extremely strict membership requirements, it's not out of the question that some may have made an early exit when the world and country they once knew burned to the ground. The historical buildings that once housed the government and its shadow government, the Enclave, had different fates as well. We can see the Capitol building 200 years after the Great War, but it does not appear to have suffered a direct nuclear strike. Some portions have walls and ceilings caved in, sure, and the dome seems to have sustained a bunch of damage as well, but I'm not convinced that this damage was the result of a strike. Inside the rotunda, there's a bunch of scaffolding against only one side of the wall, and that is the side where the rotunda has damage. This makes it seem like the dome had prior damage that was in the process of being fixed before the Great War interrupted that effort, and the dome partially collapsed in the 200 years since. The Pentagon, the headquarters for the Department of Defense, does not appear to have suffered a direct strike either, although some portions are heavily damaged, in particular the destroyed corner that the Brotherhood of Steel have turned into the entrance. The building may have somehow escaped a direct nuclear strike, perhaps only sustaining damage from nearby detonations or non-nuclear ordnance. There are also no skeletons inside, but this is likely the result of the Brotherhood cleaning up the place when they took over, although a couple skeletons can be found in a normally inaccessible part of the Citadel, implying that many may have been inside the building when the bombs landed. The White House, on the other hand, took a direct hit, obliterating the building, leaving only columns, debris, and a lower basement level with several skeletons and some mini nukes, which are apparently the remains of the skeleton crew that was left to care for the building since the president had abandoned it months prior. We don't rightly know what happened to many federal agencies and groups, even high-profile ones like the CIA or FBI after the Great War, but what we know of a few may give us some ideas. The Secret Service is most well known for their duty to protect the president, the vice president, and their families, as well as investigating financial crimes, especially that of money forgery. It is highly likely that when the President of the United States retreated to the oil rig, that Secret Service agents remained close by, fulfilling their protective duties, because over 160 years later, we see them still performing that function. However, in the years leading up to the Great War, the US government decided to relocate the gold reserves that were held at Fort Knox and have it stored in a blast-proof Vault-Tec vault, number 79, located in Appalachia. This was seen as a protective measure and would allow the post-war government to have the wealth necessary post-war to continue functioning. Once the gold had been successfully moved, a team of Secret Service members were tasked with remaining in the vault to guard the nation's gold. And oh boy, is there a lot. 25 years after the Great War, they remain, fewer in number, but resolute in their task of protecting the nation's gold reserves. But we really do need to ask ourselves, how long could they hold out, and could they truly stave off any sufficiently determined and well-equipped group who could potentially come and claim this immense treasure? Fallout's version of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, is the National Catastrophe Relief Auxiliary, likely under the management of Homeland Security, and it was deployed in Washington, D.C. the day prior to the Great War. Due to advanced warning early in the evening of October 22nd, the auxiliary was deployed throughout D.C., with one unit leaving solid records after establishing themselves at the Germantown police station outside of downtown. Although this specific unit survived the initial bombing, even with the help from a National Guard unit, they were quickly overwhelmed by the number of survivors that were injured or rapidly falling ill due to radiation poisoning. Plenty of people within the auxiliary were worried about the fate of their own families, or were scared for their lives, and began deserting, making an already tenuous situation hopeless. Without leadership or supplies, even the reservists began to succumb to the radiation, slowly dying off until no one was left to care or be cared for. This is the most likely fate of most government groups and agencies, left without leaders or support to wither away in the wake of overwhelming destruction and suffering. Perhaps most agencies were simply abandoned without much fanfare, as the DIA base, known as the Switchboard, has no records of what all the intelligence officers did after nuclear strikes were confirmed, and the ultra-secretive base is devoid of old skeletons, except for one lady who was hitting the jet a little too hard in the bathroom. Many such places appear to have been unceremoniously abandoned without much thought. An unknown number of agencies and departments had been transformed by the Enclave to fit their new needs, like the aforementioned Secret Service, but also the Atomic Energy Commission, which 160 years after the Great War still exists and is in charge of maintaining the oil rigs reactor. We can't be sure that every government agency continued to exist in the pre-war under the auspices of the Enclave, but certainly a number of them have been adapted to fit their very different post-war needs. In contrast to the federal government and its officers, state governments do not appear to have been privy to the early warning system, nor were they allowed to take refuge in the decked-out, taxpayer-funded presidential and congressional retreats. So it comes as no surprise that the ones we know about, because we only know about a few, did not fare well. The pre-war state of Massachusetts was on the cusp of dealing with a tyrannical governor just weeks before the Great War, which would ruin whatever long-term plans the governor had in store. Lieutenant Governor Graham was the duly elected governor who was obsessed with projecting a strong image, allocated funds away from public services and towards the military, cooked the books so that the public was unaware of how he was spending money, and when the state treasurer objected to this fraud and committed himself to resign, the governor staunchly refused to lose his position or power. Graham therefore declared himself the provisional governor, a position that is usually only used during transitional periods between civil strife, revolution, or civil war, none of which was actually happening. His sudden power grab was not well received, and after a number of protests that damaged the state capitol building, Provisional Governor Graham declared martial law, instituted a curfew, set up military checkpoints, and authorized roaming military robots that would look out for communist infiltrators and curfew breakers. Such was the state of the Commonwealth and its power-hungry governor when the bombs touched down on October 23rd. While we don't know the actual fate of the state government or even Governor Graham, the complete lack of any written record or recorded word may be an instance where silence speaks louder than words. But the presence of curfew enforcing Mr. Gutsy robots 210 years after the Great War indicates that martial law was never lifted. Just as bombs were detonating, the mayor of Boston and his family were cowering in a private bunker with an angry mob of civilians trying to break in and execute some good old-fashioned mob justice. The mayor, Mr. Hildebrand, had been embezzling public funds from the city to build a large, very nice private bunker west of the city, complete with such amenities as a basketball court. Somehow, his fellow Bostonians learned of this bunker just as Mr. Hildebrand and his family fled to the shelter there, and they began to clash with the numerous soldiers that were posted to guard the bunker. The civilians demanded the mayor be held accountable for stealing money to protect him and his family, and this would eventually turn violent. When it became clear that the mob would not disperse, and they would sooner or later gain access through the use of heavy machinery, Mr. Hildebrand did the only thing he thought he could to defuse the situation by taking a bath with a toaster. The mayor's death would not be enough for the mob that would eventually break in and take revenge on his wife and children, and all that is left 200 years later, when we can inspect the bunker ourselves, are skeletons, synths, and one sneaky deathclaw. It is obvious that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was in a dire state in the lead up to the Great War due to corruption and ambition on the part of local leaders, meaning that they likely stood no chance to effectively govern or even escape the ire of their constituents in the post-war. A good deal south in West Virginia, the local government functioned only marginally better in both the pre- and post-war. Appalachia was going through something of a revolution where influential mining companies were eager to replace their demanding and whiny human workers with tireless, automated systems, and they lobbied the state and local politicians heavily to curry favor. There was one real holdout for the people and workers of Appalachia, the very same Senator Sam Blackwell that we discussed earlier, who was making enemies all over the place amongst the Enclave and powerful and wealthy mining companies in West Virginia. Blackwell would be run off by these sinister forces in the days leading up to the Great War, and the Governor Evans, would act quickly to quarantine off Blackwell's office and initiate a special election to fill his seat. Evans was glad to be rid of Blackwell since he had benefited greatly, both personally and politically, from his support of automation, but mere weeks before October 23rd, the West Virginia State Treasury Secretary would uncover evidence of embezzlement on the part of Evans. Spooked by the prospect of an official investigation and possibility of jail time, Governor Evans destroyed all his computers and hard drives before fleeing to never be seen again. The West Virginia Majority Leader also went missing at this time, implying that he had been complicit in this corruption as well. This caused the local government to grind to a halt while the remaining officials tried to figure out how to move forward. And just when they thought it couldn't get any worse, missiles flew, bombs dropped, and everything changed. The emergency government was tossed out of the pan and into the fire as they quickly had to mobilize and address the mounting needs of the local people, completely isolated and unable to contact the federal government in Washington. Although the capital of West Virginia, Charleston, sustained no direct hits, large-scale disasters unfolded and would continue to unfold, and new powerful groups would emerge from the metaphorical and sometimes literal ashes. In the absolute chaos, the official chain of command was not followed, and the Speaker of the House assumed the leading role of the provincial council that led the emergency government. The emergency government didn't hold nearly the authority or control that it did prior to the war and was forced to suspend unneeded programs in order to focus their meager resources where it was most effective. It also meant that they were forced to cooperate and form alliances with the new power players in the region, namely the Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel, the Responders, which were comprised of police, firefighters, and medical personnel, and the Free States, a group of anarchist preppers. The often overlapping interests of these groups didn't ensure seamless cooperation, and even the members of the council disagreed heavily over the best course of action and which of these new factions to throw their support behind, since even the state's first responders barely pretended to follow their orders. All this infighting and these disagreements would be for naught, because the emergency government would meet their end suddenly and catastrophically. A leader of one of the local raider gangs, the Cutthroats, would blow up and destroy the Charleston Dam and release a city-destroying torrent of water on Charleston and its Capitol building, wiping out entire buildings, flooding whole districts, and apparently completely ending the emergency government after struggling for only 5 years. Northeast of Appalachia, the mayor of New Jersey's infamous gambling metropolis, Atlantic City, had a whole different approach to governance than her counterparts in Massachusetts. Carly Day was a successful and well-liked mayor, although she owed all of her success to her well-selected and hard-working administrative team. They were so good at what they did that Mayor Day didn't have to do almost anything, which made her completely unprepared for the day the world ended. Atlantic City wasn't destroyed by a direct nuclear strike, but rather it had been catastrophically flooded, leaving only the entertainment district dry and safe. Mass confusion, violence, and looting was rampant as the mayor scrambled with many of her staff members dead or missing to establish the Atlantic City municipal government to try and control the chaos. Lacking any true leadership skills and selfishly hoarding food rations that the city's people depended on, Mayor Day faced even more protests and resignations from her staff and eventually the people of the city. Without the manpower to maintain a firm grip on the city, she was forced to start working closely with one of the only other groups with any power, a mob group known as the Family. The municipal government was supposed to keep the lights on and the water running, while the mob would contain unrest and go shake down farms, forcing them to give up a portion of their produce. The mayor had sold her soul to the devil as the mob kept her alive and in power as a figurehead, while they ran around essentially unopposed, even as conditions in the city continued to fall. The mob was only interested in keeping the casino quarter operational by violently extorting everyone else in order to keep the caps and food rolling in. One day, the mob's grunts would threaten the exact wrong farmstead, one owned by Timothy and Frida Lane, and this mistake would doom the feckless mayor. Timothy and his wife gunned down the group that was threatening them, made their way to Atlantic City, and walked straight into the city hall and shot the mayor dead. Tim and Frida would assume leadership of the municipal government and be far more effective than Mayor Day ever was, better at providing food, water, power, and even protection while dealing with the family and a new influential faction known as the Showmen. As of around 25 years after the Great War, this municipal government is still functioning, although it is only due to a tenuous relationship and subtle power struggle with the other two large factions in the city. There is a power production and management division, water purification and distribution division, agricultural and caravanning services, emergency services division for medics and firefighters, and even an internal revenue service with a team of auditors that investigate and motivate people, even the mob, to pay taxes that are owed. These auditors are some of the baddest government employees, or munis as they are known, around, heavily armed and led by a former raider known as Buttercup that will F you up at a moment's notice if he suspects that you are evading taxes. Finally, there is the Forestry Division, which sounds like a strange department to have in the post-war, but their primary responsibility is to track down and address a new and growing threat. The overgrown are one of a few different plant-based mutated creatures that the city has recently been increasingly threatened by, and which will continue to test this newly revived municipal government. Whether they can maintain power in Atlantic City will remain to be seen. The governments that once held an iron grip over the people of the United States predictably faltered in the post-war chaos. Local governments had no warning and very little time to prepare, and they fared the worst, with those that were corrupt or weak of will failing quickly. The government of Massachusetts and Boston seemed to fall quickly. In West Virginia, they lasted only 5 years before being wiped out by a cataclysmic flood due to crazed raiders, and Atlantic City has only lasted for 25 years or so due to a change in leadership. The pre-war politicians were just not up to snuff. The federal government fared much better due to the early warning systems and huge taxpayer-funded shelters that they could quickly retreat to. There's only one known Great War casualty in DC. However, those that truly benefited the most were the members of the Enclave, who worked for years behind the scenes to position themselves as post-war survivors. They worked backroom deals, threatened and assassinated those that opposed them, and on the day of the Great War, purged all non-Enclave government personnel. All known state government buildings have survived. The United States Capitol seemed to somehow not suffer a direct hit, nor did the Pentagon, but the White House was blown straight back to Adam. Washington, D.C., the once proud and prominent capital, received multiple direct strikes and was drowned in radioactivity, with many survivors falling ill and dying shortly after, with the city itself sitting in a green haze. At this point, the only known surviving government officials are within the Enclave, and although they have changed considerably, they seem to have the most legitimate claim of any group who purports to be the actual United States authority. Why is that even important though? 10 years after, 100 years after, or even 200 years after, do wastelanders care, or do they even know much about the long-dead country that they were never even a part of? Since the United States had been a long-standing world superpower prior to the war, it could make sense that groups may want to tap into that legitimacy, whether it's real or perceived, in the same way that, historically, the Roman Empire has had many claimants who wish to use the image of power and prestige to bolster their own empire or monarchical rule. The Byzantine, Ottoman, Russian, Carolingian, and Holy Roman Empire were some such empires that claimed to be the true continuation of the once mighty Roman Empire. So could the Enclave be following a similar pattern, invoking the might, power, and prestige of the pre-war United States to legitimize their own, obviously un-American faction that seeks to exert control over the irradiated wasteland? Regardless, as of about 220 years after the events of the Great War, the Enclave exists in isolated pockets across the wastes. Having lost most members in Appalachia around 20 years after the Great War, suffered catastrophic losses including their president at the oil rig in 2241, and those survivors of the oil rig destruction were decimated again after trekking across the nation to claim the Raven Rock complex in 2277. It seems that this one known specter of the US government is barely clinging on 2 centuries after Earth's fiery baptism. Thank you for being here with me today to hear the word of Adam. As always, I'm curious what you think and what you would like to see looking forward at new Fallout media in relation to these pre-war groups and institutions that recklessly veered the world into Armageddon. If you enjoyed this and like what I do, support me any way you deem appropriate, and consider joining Adam's Army either on Patreon or YouTube, like these fine, devoted followers on screen now. They help make it possible to allow me to do what I do. A special welcome to new members: Cheesy Presto, Matt Storer, The Foundation, Lai, and Jakub Zajic. I don't know if I was even close with that. As always, a special mention of those in the top all to Adam tier: Akrid B, Gardner Minshew Simp, Dominic White, Tapey Papey, The Bread Man, Tyler Eaton, Owen Balzer, Ann94, Tessa Storm, The Love Mummy, Shallow Fire 13, Phantom Inc., Tater Anus, Ace Jacobs, and Cheesy Presto. Adam is pleased. Please everyone, take care of yourselves and all of Adam's creations, and I will see you soon.